Welcome to the Pop Culture Show. I'm your co-host, Lilith Dorsey, and that's my other co-host.
I'm Jason Winslade. We put the show in pop culture, pop occulture, and we do crazy things every other week. Talk about stuff in pop occulture, films, TV, comics, all kinds of things. And this week we are talking about Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain, and this is going to be an interesting episode because usually when we choose these things, we're more or less on the same page. We might have some different takes on things occasionally, and based on our interests and experiences and life. Um, but in this case, it appears, much to my chagrin, that that we see very differently on this particular film. So, yeah, we're
Yeah,
we're
I hated it. I
we're gonna
hated
get
it.
into it. Hated it. And for me, it when I saw it at the time, and it was 2006. So yeah, 2006 when it came out. My daughter had just been born, um, and I guess I was in a place, and I saw this movie and I loved it, and it became one of my favorite films of that decade. And this is the first time I think I've rewatched it since then. And some things I'm a bit I see in a bit more critical eye than I did then. Um, all I know is, I mean, I saw it in the theater and I was overwhelmed by it, and I was, you know, torrents of tears at the end of it. Um, I was sitting in the theater, and behind me there was an elderly gentleman who was openly weeping, and he talked to me afterwards and said his wife died of cancer, and so this was incredibly moving for him. And so, if you haven't seen the film, I mean, I'll throw some stuff out at you. It's basically about grief and death, and one man's journey to accept his wife's passing from cancer. He's a surgeon. He's a or like a research uh, doctor, and he's trying to find all these ways to extend life, to fight cancer, all of this. And the way that the film originally was promoted was that it was three stories: one in the past, one in the present, one in the future, and that it was Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz playing all these characters. So it seemed like it was this, you know, triple narrative. But really, when you watch the film, I mean, there are some unclear things, but for the most part, I think it's the present with the past and the future in their imaginations, in the way that they process what's happening, and it's mostly from Hugh Jackman's, the main character's, point of view. And it just his character's name's Tommy, and I read that it was actually named Tommy after Major Tom from
Oh,
Space
look at that.
Oddity. So there's some Bowie going on in there. But yeah, the past takes place in sort of in the Mayan jungle, and there's Spanish conquistadors and all this kind of stuff. The future thing, where Hugh Jackman is completely shaved and gaunt, and doing lots of lotus yoga positions, and flying in a spherical sort of spaceship with a tree, that he has this connection to. So that's sort of like the visuals of the film. Um, so it's one of those films so okay, Darren Aronofsky, the director, he's sort of, he's kind of considered an auteur these days. His first film, Pi, was very steeped in Kabbalistic ideas, a lot of gematria, a lot of stuff about the word of God, and through Hebrew. So it was a very low budget film. And then, of course, Requiem for a Dream was what he was really well known for. And since then, he's done all kinds of movies with Oscar winners. He's done Black Swan, most recently The Whale, not without its controversy as well. And so this was his first film after the considerable indie success of Requiem for a Dream, and it took him a while. And he was supposed to do it, I think, with double the budget, with Brad Pitt and Kate Blanchett. And ultimately, because of the studio thought he was over budgeted, and Brad Pitt had to back out, he supposedly regretfully, and so he went for Hugh Jackman, who he had just seen. Even though Jackman was famous at that point for being Wolverine in the X-Men, he had seen Hugh Jackman in the his Boy from Oz, one person musical, and thought, that's the guy for me. And Rachel Weisz was Aronofsky's wife at the time. They were married, I think, from like 2001, 2010, and then right after that, she went with Daniel Craig, Bond, and has been with him ever since. So there was, so yeah, Rachel Weisz was married to Aronofsky at the time. So there's a lot of layers there about personal stories and things like that. So let's get into it. Okay. Let me put it this way. We're gonna table the conquistador stuff for now. We'll definitely get into that. But other than that, what didn't work for you with this film?
Okay, well, you're talking about, when it was released, and that's sort of significant for me because I finished grad school, I want to say 2004, 2005. And one of the struggles I had with grad school was I was always making experimental films with a nonlinear narrative. And I think that this film is an example of why a nonlinear narrative doesn't work. I think that he does it so badly that it's just almost juvenile to me that there's this connection with the ring, and there's connection with, like, she's moving through time and she's his queen. Okay, I'm leaving the conquistadors out even for now, but it's just was so confusing to me. Like, it just didn't flow the way it was supposed to. It didn't come to me as memory. You're saying that this is bits of memory or bits of foresight into the future. I don't think the way he handled that was effective at all. I think that there were definitely times where, despite the visual changes, I was still like, where are we? What is happening? So it was confusing on that note. What else didn't I like about it? The dialogue I thought was really bad, like compared to talking about like Water for Chocolate, which I was so happy about the screenplay. Every line is almost something you can quote and is inspirational. Whereas this, I don't think there's any inspirational lines, really. It's all sappy, like a Harlequin romance novel.
Yeah. See, I
and a
think
cheap one.
part of the confusion is that so in the story, one of the things that we see with their relationship, which is very common in these kinds of situations, is that Hugh Jackman's character Tommy is just in denial. He doesn't want to deal with the fact that his wife is dying, and instead of taking the time to be with her, he's so focused on trying to save her. And she's accepted it. She's at this point where she has this almost this grace about her. And so part of the story is that she's written this book, handwritten with fountain pen and ink, like an actual fountain pen. She's handwritten this thing somehow with cancer. She could do this. And it's her allegory for his heroic efforts to save her. And that's what I mean about that part of the story, the past story, the conquistador story, is because she had this fascination with Mayan culture and Mayan history, and she goes to that museum and everything. She's come up with this allegory, again, very problematic, and we'll get to that in a minute. But that's her thing. Now, the future thing, again, yeah, you're right. It's not very clear, although my interpretation of it is that even though we don't see any of it in reality, my interpretation of it is that this is somehow representative of him working through his grief after she dies, or yeah, that this is like his deep subconscious. And that's the thing, like you say, there's no poetic dialogue. I mean, like Butter for Chocolate is poetry left and right. This isn't about this isn't this doesn't work that part of the brain. This isn't about dialogue or about poetry. It's about visual. It's about the subconscious. So there's a lot other things going on where, yeah, the dialogue isn't great. It's not really meant to be. But yeah, like if you're not on board with that psychedelic ride, then yeah, it's gonna be, I think, a challenge.
Well, I mean, I think, and you really pointed it out, this whole sort of outlook that he has, that he can save her. So instead of doing what she needs from him at that moment, which is just living in the moment and enjoying the snow and enjoying, their little bit of time that they have left together, he's yelling at her, and he's running away to the lab, and he's doing all these things. And even when we see him in the future, it's funny to me because that bubble that he's in, it almost reminds me of those terrariums that were really big in the early 2000s, that
Sure.
you could get this little sphere that was just going to live on its own and be self-supportive. But what does he do in that? It's still, he's in there, and he's got a tree, and he's scraping the bark off the tree, and it's so problematic to me as a green witch. There's no like, oh, because I'm thinking of like Fern Gully and the other movies that have like iconic trees, right? There's no thank you tree. He's just like, it'll be okay. I'm going to rip a piece of your bark off and squeeze some spermy looking stuff out of it, but it'll be okay
And eat
because I
it.
can save my wife. Like,
Right.
what?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, and that's why, like, I know that is problematic, and I think we're supposed to know that, because we see, like in the past, when he finally gets to the tree, and he's stabbing it, he's penetrating the tree with a knife, and the spermy stuff, it looked like marshmallow, but he's like, "Ah, ah, ah," ah," he's trying to eat it, thinking that, like, okay, it's gonna say, but because of that, the flowers grow up out of him, and he's like, he's killed, but from that. But, like, so that's the thing, is like, yeah, even in that future thing, he's he's doing all that manly, like, weekend warrior kind of thing. Well, he's tattooed rings around himself for every year. He lost his wedding ring, so you know so he punishes himself by doing the fountain pen tattoo around his, so he's doing all this self flagellation stuff, and there's even that image of the monk, scarring himself from self flagellation, and her spirit is there, and he's mad at her, and he's yelling at her, like you said, but she's ultimately telling him, you got to let go. And it's not until towards the end where he has this epiphany that, like, I'm going to die. this there's no I mean, there is no fix for this. There is no real fountain of youth. There's just this moment, and he's able to sort of put himself back, almost kind of time travel in a way, and put himself back in that moment where he could have made that choice to be with her in the snow. And so I think that's the journey. And ultimately, like, so there's this whole thing where they were saying, I was reading up on it, and when they had this Australian crew, they had them watch a bunch of different films, and one of them was Holy Mountain. um they saw Holy Mountain as not only a thematic precursor, but they wanted to give the designers a sense of, like, when they were going to do the whole Mayan temple, they were going to do the Mayan temple much more elaborate than it was because of their budget. But yeah, they showed them Holy Mountain. So there's this thing in Holy Mountain, where, it's that journey of the fool, and they're doing all this intense, insane stuff, but ultimately, in the end, it's kind of like, oh, well, this is all just show. This is all just play. And really, the true journey is inside. And it is sort of this, like, rejection of, it's almost a rejection of spirituality in a way. And that's what it's like, he's got, he's doing the Tai Chi, he's in the lotus position, he's got all this stuff, and it's like it ultimately doesn't matter. Like he's still the tree is still going to die. That they're heading towards in the Mayan cosmology, they're heading towards Xibalba, the dying star, right? But yeah, so that's why I think there is that connection, that you're not supposed to think that it's a good idea that he's doing these things. He's enforcing his will upon something that cannot be changed. And so yeah, he's messing up. And it's
Yeah.
not until later he has that epiphany. And yeah, is it, I mean, is it earned? Is it whatever? It's because, again, we don't see any progress in reality, but it's meant to be a metaphysical journey. So yeah, there's some.
No, it's problematic for me. I'm sorry. Like it's a story of, we've got this, they set out. I mean, you said Shabalba, so can I go there now?
All
Like
right, talk
it
about that.
starts out almost from this premise of cultural rape to me, right? Like we're going to go there and we're going to steal this, thing, and we're going to have the secret of eternal life, and it's going to save Spain. You know what I mean? So it starts out problematic in the beginning, and then he's still literally like stabbing and raping the tree. Yeah, he dies at the end. I wish he died in the beginning, because I can't. Oh, well, we're not really in control over nature, and we're not really here to subdue the savages. Of course we're not. Shut up. We don't need 2 hours to tell us this. Like that's where I am with it. I mean, he can't even care for the people that are around him. And although I did want to say this, I love Ellen Burstyn. I want to have a thing where if anybody's watching our stuff from back to back, take a shot every time you see Ellen Burstyn, because
I
I
know,
think she's
like,
going to continue to
like
do that.
The Exorcist thing. This, is there another one? I don't remember.
Well, I
Yeah,
want to
Ellen
do
Burstyn.
that one where she's the psychic, but so there we go. But
Oh right,
I,
Jesus.
yeah, I think
Yeah, well, it's
that's
funny
one of
because
my favorites.
Darren Aronofsky basically revived her career with Requiem for a Dream. Like she
Hmm.
wasn't doing much, and then suddenly, bam, she was everywhere again. Like
Yeah. No, I love her.
25 years later. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that she has a cameo in this, and she's the one telling him, you gotta get out of your head and be present with your wife, because she's
Yeah.
you know
I mean, I'm
yeah.
curious as to why you picked this. I mean, I know it's one of your favorites, but to me, it's not really an occult story. It's almost a Christian story. I mean, they're sort of anti-Inquisition. Who is an anti-Inquisition? But the things that they set it up seem very traditional religion to me. And I think that that's what's missing in it for me, as even thinking of it in an occult context.
Well, I think there's several things. One is, like I said, there was certainly this background that Aronofsky had, that is, it's Judeo-Christian. There's definitely a lot of Jewish stuff in there as well, but it's Kabbalistic. And there was a lot of Kabbalah going on in Pi. So there's that background, but also the tree of life, the way that they refer to it, is ostensibly, I mean, obviously it's a universal symbol. There's the Mayan tree of life. There's the Norse tree of life, but there's also the Kabbalistic tree of life. Um, and even though there's not a clear one-to-one correspondence in the film that you can see, Aronofsky, in interviews, talks about the Sephiroth tree, that this is meant to be the tree itself. In Kabbalah, that tree is meant to be that journey from the mundane to the divine, right? It's that lightning flash from the earth, the lower echelons of material existence, Malkut, and it goes, through the tree up to Keter, to the divine. And that's what Bowie refers to in Station to Station, the one lightning flash from Keter to Malkut. That's that line. That's what that is referring to. So there's definitely there's that thing of there's a lot of stuff in, when you think about like Genesis, if you think about Genesis as an esoteric text, there's a lot going on there that I think is really fascinating, especially if you have grown up in a Christian uh, Christian setting. That, oh, it's not that Adam and Eve messed up and now they have to wear fig leaves or whatever. Um, that there's that motion where it's like that movement where they ate of the tree of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil, and so there, because there were two trees, there was the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, and there's been lots of stuff written, from Milton all the way to Neil Gaiman to all this stuff, where it's like, oh yeah, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is what actually, God didn't want us to do that, but that's the thing that actually evolves us. That's the thing that gets us past this childlike existence where we just don't know. And now it's like, oh, we know what this is about now. And so the tree of life is that thing where, like, if we had eaten out of that, how would our evolution be different? So I think there's a lot of stuff going on that, yes, it's grounded in uh, Judeo-Christianity, but it's also esoteric and it's also occult. And there's also the thing of, like, again, there's a lot of the imagery is very, there's just mandala imagery everywhere, and there's like, just from a design standpoint, I think that there's just some beautiful shots of architecture and shapes, and you see that different mandala designs, all the different ways that even the what do you call it, the when they put it's a Christian thing, but when they put the piece of hair that's got all that stuff around it, like like it's a sun, like that's meant to be like almost like a Christian mandala. And then he does his lotus position stuff, and there's clearly like a Buddhist thing happening there too. So there's a lot of esoterica happening, but
I
it's
think it just reads as cultural appropriation. I don't think it reads as esotericism. I don't. I don't. I mean, the whole thing about Xibalba, even when she's in the museum, she's like, we found a Mayan book. Like, how hard would it have been just to put, we found a Mayan codex? Like, like, how can we not just have a little teeny bit of respect for the thing that we're taking and using for our own purposes and rewriting and misunderstanding? Like, it's not my area of study, but I do have a good friend who, right around the time that this film was made, was actually digitizing and working on decoding codices for Brown University, because that's where he got his degree in Latin American studies. So, like, this was definitely something that at the time was a huge amount of scholarship went behind, but they decide to just leave all of that out. I think that the longer we're going to get from this film, the more problematic it's going to be, because you couldn't make this today without advisors that knew what they were talking about. You couldn't have this wacko depiction of the Mayans and, Xibalba and all of this. Like, it's just, you couldn't do it. She couldn't even write a book about it without people attacking her, let alone having a whole kind of film about it.
Well, the thing about pop culture that we've touched on sometimes, but a lot of what pop culture is in its history is appropriative. It is something where, like, so think about 2006, and the fact that we were coming up on 2012, the Mayan apocalypse and all that. There was this infusion of Mayan, interest in culture that was going on at the time, and uh, 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 morally justified or not, it was very present. So it's not surprising that there, because Aronofsky himself talked about being very interested in. They did a lot of research. He was very interested in Mayan cosmology, and they actually got Mayan actors to do those things in the films. So they at least weren't putting, like, white guys and brown face. The bar was low, but so
As
there was
low.
this interest in it. And so when you think about, like, even the way that, say, Egyptology was a huge pop culture thing in, you know, the Victorian era, that's colonialism there too. So
Of
it,
course.
you know, and I'm of course not excusing it, but it is very much a part. You know, I don't think we could talk about pop culture without addressing those issues. So yeah, you're right. Like it totally would not have flown today. And it's funny to think that, you know, this was only like 20 years ago. Um, and that things have, I think, evolved. And that's what I was saying about how, like, when I was rewatching it, I was like, ooh, like cringing about all this stuff, but I didn't think twice about it then. And
Sure.
because it wasn't even though I had been to grad school, you know, where we talked about this stuff all the time, it still be it still to me served a story, and I didn't have that response. Now, of course,
Yeah.
you know, from my experience as a white guy, like you know, I wasn't as aware of it. Whereas, you know, people who are not white certainly would have been back then too. So, you know, when we talk about the evolution of society, we're really talking about evolution of how white people see things. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, I mean, totally, I get that. But I think part of what allowed me to sort of, I don't want to say see past it because clearly you can't, but I think what made the film emotive for me, and again, I didn't, I had a huge emotional reaction back then. I didn't watching it on DVD or on Blu-ray, because I actually had it on Blu-ray on my TV. I didn't have that same reaction. Whereas in the theater, I was bawling. Like I think it was because I was so caught up in that visual journey. So there's this whole thing at the end where he, you know, like he gets enlightenment somehow, and it's just like, the whole thing explodes, and there's like all kinds of visuals. It's very Kubrickian in the in a sense, like
Yes.
very kind of 2001. So there's definitely there's that connection there too. And again, just that whole thing of, you know, how would you respond if your wife was dying and you couldn't do anything about it? If the love of your life was dying and you couldn't do anything about it, you know, to me, I mean, even though, yeah, he made bad decisions, and which later on I think he realized and tried to undo those in his, at least in his imagination. But it's understandable. It's understandable that someone would fight that hard to save the love of their life, but it's ultimately, that's in a way that's colonialism. It's colonizing death.
Well, that's what I'm saying. He's centering himself in the story. She's the one who's dying. She's the one who needs compassion. And yet it's still about him. He's got to go into the lab. He's got to, you know, mess with this monkey. Like, what?
Yeah, it's colonizing death, and I think
Mm-hmm.
I think that's worthy of a critique, certainly, and I think that says something a lot about what, you know, who Aronofsky was and what he was going through at the time as well. Um, but you know, this isn't out of place with the history of Western narratives around death and around
No.
spirituality and around colonialism. It's not out of the ordinary, unfortunately. But yeah, it's not necessarily anything to be emulated, but I think there's, you know, there's something to be said about like looking at what they were doing visually and deriving inspiration from that. Now, I said, you know, I said like at the time it was a bomb, the box office bomb, but it's kind of garnered this cult following since then. So that's, it's interesting that in some ways people have looked at it differently. So we're kind of doing the opposite, where I was like, I was all about it at the time. No.
You know, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that he was married to her at the time because she's almost a non-person. She's almost like the queen in a chess set or something. You know what I mean? Like she's behind the screen in the front and removed, and you know, and then she's removing herself out into the snow, and then but in the future she's dead. You know, like so it's like she never is present as a person, even in the smallest way, and that really upsets me as well.
So yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, it's very clear that it is one of those things that we would be less tolerant of today in terms of, you know, a woman's character being the purpose for the man's development, right? That trope,
Yes.
huge part of that. So no arguments there, definitely. And what's funny is that apparently, because Kate Blanchett was supposed to do originally, and he didn't want to cast Rachel Weisz because he didn't want to give any appearance that he was playing favorites or whatever, and it was Hugh Jackman who convinced him to do it. So yeah, and so that what was there's an interview on the Blu-ray where while Hugh Jackman is getting made up with all the fake tattoos and stuff like that, Rachel Weisz is sitting there talking to him and asking him about his experience, and they're having this discussion about what it was like for them and how they had never been pushed that hard in a positive way in a production before. And so it was really apparently very intense and spiritual for them. But yeah, there's there's a lot going on there in terms of the gender politics is not great either. Because I didn't show you this. I wore this today. This is my
Oh, look at that.
culturally appropriative. I believe it was. Yeah, it was somebody that was selling these things in Thailand. So
there we go. Right on.
Right,
no, I just feel like it just borrows everything into this big mishmash. So, 0 stars, do not recommend. That's where I'm at with this movie.
I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't celebrate it, but I think it is. I think it's worth a look in terms of its use of imagery, and yeah, it is out of context, and I think that's fair. But at the same time, there's something to be said about taking this in visually and having that experience where you are in contact with that kind of vibe. Also, I think it is a good lesson about grief, I think.
Okay.
I definitely understand your objections. So that's it for us for this episode. It's always fun to have a different perspectives and even a debate of somewhat. I like that. I think it would be boring if we agreed on everything all the time.
We would never agree on everything.
Oh, right. But I mean, I think it can be interesting when we have these different perspectives, and certainly there are certain things like I would never have come up with some of the things you've come up with, and I was really glad to have been exposed to them. You may not be as glad to be exposed to this, but I think there's definitely things out there that we can do. So once again, thanks for joining us, and give us your comments. If you are a fan of The Fountain, show me some support. If you hate it, also I'll also show your support for Lilith. It's not really like a for or against thing, but I'd love to hear what the general consensus is on the film, as problematic as it is. So yeah, leave us some comments. Again, look at our Patreon. We're doing some great stuff over there. We've got some great extra conversations on there, and definitely we have a lot of those when we have our guests on, because there's lots that we talk about. So make sure to follow us and subscribe and all the things, and we'll see you next time on
The Pop Culture Show. Thank you.
Where you too can explore problematic things in cinema. All right. See you next time.
Bye.